My name is Paul Espinosa, in case you haven't met me before. I'm the president of the Eric W. Gritsch Memorial Fund, and so thank you for coming out and supporting the work of the fund. Part of what we do is support Reformation scholarship, and so this is a wonderful opportunity to make a local connection with the Walters, who has just acquired within the last 2 years, a wonderful Reformation, unique illumination of a Reformation book. This is a blog written by Dr. Herbert, who we're going to be hearing from today, to the collection. And this is quite a beautiful book, as you can see. I won't go into the details here, but it's a printed book with hand illuminations, which is in its own form a rare bird. And Dr. Herbert has been unpacking this work recently, and so she wrote this wonderful blog, and so I encourage you to check it out. It's on the walters.org website, and just in the search criteria put blog or Reformation book, you'll find it. What's so great is that we have a wonderful connection with Dr. Herbert and our own Una Hahn, who many of you have heard from before, and I just thought this was quite sweet. You can see Dr. Herbert dedicated this blog post to Una when Una was a fellow there at the Walters. Una is completing her PhD at Hopkins. Anyway, check out this blog. It's quite informative. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Herbert. Dr. Linley Herbert is the Robert and Nancy Hall Associate Curator of Rare Books and Manuscripts at the Walters. She received her PhD from the University of Delaware, and she has been at the Walters for about 9.5 years now, almost 10 years. And she's the ultimate museum, what do you call it, dream story. She started out there as a volunteer and also working in membership. And then she, from 2001 to 2004, then she left to get her PhD. And they must have liked her so much they brought her back in 2010 as a curator of the rare books and manuscripts. Currently she's working on their next major exhibit, centering on the St. Francis Missal. And so we hope to do some programming perhaps around that, and the Walters will certainly be doing a lot of programming. That will be from February through May of 2020. And there'll be there's a whole long, wonderful story about the St. Francis Missal, but believers think it's something of a relic, and so there will be lots of crowds here in Baltimore. The last time there was 44,000 people came to see this. The last time they displayed it, so we're expecting quite a few visitors. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Linley, who's going to talk about broken books and scattered leaves today. And so please help me welcome Linley.
Thank you so much, Paul. Can everybody hear me? And thank you, Bonnie, for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here. Surely, to allow 1,000 people to have and to hold an original manuscript leaf, and to get the thrill and understanding that comes only from actual and frequent contact with these art heritages, is justification enough for the scattering of fragments. Few, indeed, can hope to own a complete manuscript book. Hundreds, however, may own a leaf. These words were spoken by Otto Egge, one of the most famous and unapologetic book breakers in modern history. This quote, from an article he wrote entitled, "I Am a Biblioclast," captures an important aspect of the spirit and philosophy that has led to the scattering of manuscript pages. While a professor at the Philadelphia Museum School of Art, and later in his position at the Cleveland Institute of Art, Egge amassed a private collection of hundreds of manuscripts and early printed books, which he both bought and sold. He soon recognized through his own personal experiences that the most effective way to learn about medieval manuscripts was to study the original objects, to hold them in your hands, to touch the parchment pages, to see the gold glinting in the light. As one who dedicated his life to teaching about these treasures to non-specialists, be they his students or the general public, his impulse became to find a way to bring these books into the lives of the most people possible. Yet even in the early 20th century, a medieval manuscript carried a hefty price tag. Eggy discovered, however, that books with broken bindings, or those that were water damaged or missing pages, could be purchased at lower prices. So these are actually some of his books that he didn't break apart. Many of the books he purchased for his own collection fell into these categories since they were more affordable, and the imperfect quality of these books likely made it easier for him to envision taking them apart. He began selling leaves individually, and later decided to create curated sets of pages and portfolios. These provided an overview of manuscript or print production across different times, places, and genres. The result of these portfolios was the dispersal of thousands of leaves across the country, many becoming study collections used for teaching at museums or universities. As a curator of rare books and manuscripts, I can understand Eggy's passion to make these treasures available to as many people as possible. It is one that our museum's founder, Henry Walters, shared. Even before giving his collection to the people of Baltimore to form an official museum in 1931, Walters regularly granted access to his rare books and manuscripts so that they could be studied and enjoyed by others. In this way, he and Eggy were like-minded, grappling with the egalitarian instinct to break down barriers and put these extraordinary pieces of history into the hands of those who would never otherwise have access to them. I spent much of my career looking for ways to do this very thing, to bring art to the public, to fire people up about the indescribable beauty of these objects, and to help people find them as fascinating as I do. I teach about 50 classes a year from the original books, and while only I can handle the full manuscripts, our study collection of leaves is invaluable for bringing the books to life, as I can pass those around the room. Yet, as a scholar, I'm also keenly aware of the problematic nature of a broken book. Cutting up books is nothing new, and in fact there's a long medieval tradition behind the practice. The reasons for removing pages are as varied as the types of books that were cut up. Often the medieval dismantling of books had less to do with the desire to share or admire the pages, and more with the recycling of precious materials. Since the parchment, or animal skin, they were made of was expensive and hard to produce, but extremely durable, outdated or damaged books were often cut apart, and their pages were used in the making of another. It is not uncommon to find manuscript pages recycled as binding material, sometimes covering the outside of the book, much like modern students used to cover textbooks with paper bags. And I did this as myself. I don't know if anybody out there did this too. Yeah, that's exactly what we're looking at here. So here's a medieval example of this exact thing in the Walters collection, which had been wrapped around another book, but has now been recovered. And it's possible to see where the book used to be, as the areas that were exposed where it was covering the binding are grungy and darkened from handling. Can you see this here? So there's the spine of the book, and there's the covers here, and then all of this was sort of folded in around the boards and wrapped in, so those parts are more preserved because they didn't get dirty from being touched. An example still on the book is this music page that has been covering a 12th century Bible since the medieval era. It's very common to find music pages reused this way, as they were often from large books and provided big sheets of parchment. In other instances, manuscript leaves can be found inside books. So this is just the paste down here of a book and the first flyleaf. And you can see these are like several different manuscripts that have been hodgepodge together here. At times, there was an aesthetic aspect of this kind of reuse as well, but they tended to be more of sort of a practical reuse of leaves. There are certainly early instances, however, when leaves were cut out of a book for the purposes of art appreciation. In a Walters manuscript that belonged to Marie de Medici, 9 illuminations from a 15th century Flemish book of hours were cut out and artfully pasted onto the introductory pages of the Queen's 17th century book. And another work in the Walters collection, known today as the Stein Quadriptych, is a series of 64 miniature paintings by the acclaimed artist Simon Benning. These tiny and amazing paintings on parchment have been framed this way for centuries. And while it is likely that they started life in a book, it has proved impossible to identify their original context. There's no writing on the back of them, so it's really hard to tell where they came from. Instances of this more aesthetic cutting and mounting of earlier manuscripts increased exponentially into the modern era. As printing became the predominant mode of book production, earlier handwritten books became novelties. Over time, as the practice of manuscript production dwindled, and few could write or illuminate books as they had done in the past, the unique quality of these handmade books led to a new fascination with them, an appreciation for them as art objects grew. In European manuscripts, the text was often of less interest since that existed in modern printed editions. Therefore, they were often farmed for their illuminations, and the rest might be discarded or used as scrap. This is less true of Islamic manuscripts, where the beauty of the calligraphy was appreciated as its own art form, and the remarkable work of specific calligraphers made them sought after by collectors. The compilation of albums became a way to pull together pages from disparate manuscripts, creating at times a who's who of important calligraphers and artists. Ultimately, this tendency to pick and choose what was of interest, to frame or scrapbook only what was most beautiful and unique, has resulted in a fascinating phenomenon of scattered books. A question I am often asked is whether or not it is problematic to acquire single leaves, and if I condone it. And to this, there's no easy answer. Today, there's always the concern that purchasing such pages is supporting modern book breakers, as this is not a practice that died with Otto Egi, but is an active issue that is often far less well justified or philosophical. Simply put, selling a book page by page is often more profitable than selling it intact. Yet even in past eras, when this practice was not yet viewed as problematic, the purchase of single leaves was still riskier than buying complete books. Our museum's founder, Henry Walters, did acquire quite a few leaves, but not always wisely. And we now have a lovely collection of pages by an artist known as a Spanish forger. This unknown painter, who was probably not Spanish at all, was prolific in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Paris. He was remarkably skilled at mimicking medieval-style illumination while never actually copying existing imagery. He was especially crafty in his reuse of genuine medieval manuscripts, for this made his illuminations far less suspect. In his early career, he attempted to integrate his own images into existing complete manuscripts in order to greatly amplify their value. However, he often showed his hand by creating images that were completely disconnected from and inappropriate for the texts that they were accompanying. This was his modus operandi, such as when he painted a luxurious scene of courtly crusaders triumphantly marching into Jerusalem to illustrate a liturgical song for the Mass of St. Peter. This kind of disconnect could be an immediate tip-off that something's amiss to anyone familiar with that text, which he clearly was not.
Did he not know Latin?
I don't know if he knew Latin. It's a good question. If he did, it didn't seem to matter to him because he did this over and over again, but people started to catch on. He quickly realized the risk of augmenting existing books and texts and slyly began to work up single leaves of pure illumination, either painting on the back blanks of medieval pages or else scraping away the text and painting on top of it. These works, detached from their proper contexts, were much more difficult to identify as forgeries and circulated on the market as any other loose leaf might. He was revealed in the 1930s by the Morgan Library's first curator, Belle de Costa Green, who recognized incongruities in his style and confirmed them with proving that some of his pigments had only been invented in the 19th century. Today, he is well known for his deceptions and his styles become more recognizable, but hundreds of his forgeries are preserved in collections throughout the world. His gamble that single leaves would be more difficult to track down and authenticate paid off. More recently, it has been discovered that this practice of creating fake manuscripts has become an issue once again, thanks in large part to the digitization of manuscripts. While there are many important benefits to offering high-resolution images of medieval works online, there are also dangers. Just a few months ago, William Duba and Christoph Luhler published a fascinating and intensely researched article in the journal Fragmentology on their alarming discovery of recently forged leaves that have made their way through the hands of dealers and into private collections. And I want to thank Paul for calling this article to my attention because this is perfect for this lecture. So in this instance, the high-resolution images of leaves available on the manuscript repository eCodices were taken advantage of by a forger who copied several pages down to every nuance of the script and imagery. The article's main case study involves an authentic 13th century tree of St. Consanguinity from the Vernon Baltimore Foundation in Switzerland. The manuscript, which is basically a visual roadmap for a family to determine appropriate bloodlines for marriages, was digitized in 2009, and then a copy turned up in a private collection in 2014. The copy is, in fact, so precise that the forger inadvertently gave their scheme away. They laid everything out exactly the same. If it had been copied by a medieval scribe, there would have been far more variation in the script and the ways that the words would naturally lay out on the page. Even if you assume it was the same scribe, they would never produce such a slavish copy, and their personal quirks would shift the spacing of the words during the fluid process of writing. The key mistake made by the forger was that they copied text anomalies that were only present in the original page due to it being cut and reassembled to fit inside a smaller bound book at some point in the past century. This is a little bit hard to see due to the light in here, but this is your original page here. Can you see this line? This is actually the end of a piece of parchment, and it's been overlaid with glue on top of this other piece. And basically the page was this long and they needed to be this long, so they chopped a chunk of text out, pushed it down, and glued it back together again to make it shorter. So this text here shouldn't follow to here at all. This is completely missing like 6 or 7 lines of text. This is the forged one. There's no break in the parchment, but the text goes the same way. So they've just copied directly through, not realizing that this shouldn't go like this, which is a dead giveaway. And the forger also did not use medieval methods while copying aspects of the illumination. So for instance, in the diagram, a medieval scribe would use a compass to create a circle and would then write the information inside of it, whereas the forger first wrote the text and then tried sloppily to circumscribe it. Can you see this here, where this word sort of pops out? And this is not even using a compass to draw this circle, whereas this is the original and you get this very neat. This is right. This is not. And this is something that we know their practice, and we know that they would never have done this. So small things like this built up quickly to signal that this page was created by someone with limited knowledge, but about actual working methods, and who clung a little too hard to the safety of copying every nuance of the original. Unfortunately, their work was good enough to fool dealers and collectors alike for at least a decade, and the identity of this modern forger remains unknown. So while this knowledge that this kind of subterfuge is happening as we speak is nerve-wracking, legitimate leaves far outweigh the fake ones on the market. And the existence of forgeries does not necessarily mean that we must avoid all single leaves, only that, as in any field of art, we must use an abundance of caution when considering acquisitions. There are, in fact, many leaves that are both authentic and unproblematic. It's easy to imagine that a single sheet of parchment or paper must be from a book, but I've encountered a surprising number of leaves that were not excised from other works, but were created to stand on their own from inception. These are both safer to acquire and in a way more fascinating, as they are unusual and often extremely personal works. For instance, the Walters owns a 7th century piece of papyrus from Coptic Egypt that is not a fragment from a scroll, but is basically an early postcard in which a young man is writing to his priest, inquiring after his health. Another much later work on paper is a Lutheran Page created as an intense act of private devotion by a man named Johann Tauber in 1752. Through remarkable use of micrography, so very tiny script, He created an image of the cross and orb of the world while writing out Lutheran doctrines and prayers. The text swirls through every part of the image, ending in the center with the rose and the Lord's Prayer. And to get a sense of how tiny this is, that hole in the center of the text is from the point of the compass as he sketched the central circle for the flower. Can you see this here? That's a compass prick. So this is the tiniest text. Tracing these words through the page, first with his pen and later with his eyes, would have been a highly personal, contemplative act. Early in my time at the Walters, we acquired another, very different kind of devotional leaf, which was also designed as a singular work. It is a large painting on parchment made for an unidentified Claretian nun circa 1530, and everything about it indicates that it was framed and hung on a wall from the start, perhaps in her cell. The page, quote-unquote, seems to have been created to commemorate her entry into the religious order of St. Clare, otherwise known as the Poor Clares, who were female followers of St. Francis. The imagery provides a complex visualization of what her commitment meant and juxtaposed the pious life of St. Clare with that of the novice nun. And you can see here that the nun that had this leaf is taking her vows here, and this is St. Clare doing the same thing. And you can tell this is St. Clare because she's got the halo. But this is St. Francis, and then the nun here has Francis and Clare sort of behind her. So it's a really wonderful, very personal thing. Clearly meant for private devotional contemplation, single leaves like this are complete works of art that can grant us valuable insights into the intimate, quiet thoughts of someone who has otherwise been lost to time. Yet there are instances when the museum is eager to acquire manuscript leaves that were indeed cut from books. A number of manuscripts in the collection are incomplete due to various past circumstances, and gathering together fragments as they come on the market has helped us reunite what has been scattered and given us a more complete picture of the book's original visual and theological scope. One of these manuscripts is the Beaupre Antiphonary, a truly remarkable and rare work created for the use of Flemish nuns in 1290. Originally produced as a set of 6 volumes, the Walters owned only 3. The other half of the set was being offered for sale at Sotheby's in 1865 when a fire broke out in a nearby house and spread quickly to the building where the manuscripts were being stored. While those 3 books as a whole were tragically damaged beyond repair, a few of the illuminations were hastily salvaged. In 2004, 3 of those fragments were offered for sale, and the Walters was delighted to be able to reunite them with what remains of their original context. In a similar effort, illuminations from another dismembered manuscript in the Walters collection have been slowly pieced back together over time. This book, known as the Conrad and Bible, is a masterpiece of Italian illumination from circa 1268. In this year, its intended recipient, the 16-year-old Conradin, king of Sicily and Jerusalem, was beheaded by his enemies. His tragic end helps us date the manuscript with precision, and the book's stunning illumination has long been admired by generations of owners. The unfortunate result of that admiration was the removal in the 19th century of many of its illuminations, and what Henry Walters purchased in 1905 is the fraction that survives as a bound book. The manuscript's distinctive imagery, with its spiky edges, Byzantine-style figures, and abundance of golden orbs, is easily recognized when circulating on the market, and to date, over 30 fragments have been recovered by the Walters. Yet while it has been exciting to gather them back, these bits have posed an especially tricky challenge for conservation. What survives are not complete pages, but rather the images alone. Cut as they are along their jagged framing lines, the fickle parchment cannot lie flat, curling up on itself with even the slightest fluctuation in humidity or temperature. Due to this issue, some of the fragments were glued down to other supports, and they are now being carefully removed by our conservation staff. The approach that has proved to be the most viable alternative has been creating what our head of book conservation, Abigail Quant, has jokingly dubbed spider trampolines. Seen here when applied to the same fragment, this method tensions the parchment perfectly by strategically attaching strands of thread between the parchment and the surrounding mat. As the parchment flexes, the strings pull back, keeping the fragment taut and flat. We are fortunate to have the expertise on hand at the museum to salvage these remarkable and fragile works of art in a way that they can once again be displayed and studied. The task now that they are gathered together and stabilized, is to try to figure out what part of the missing text the images came from and what they represent, and how we can use them to reconstruct a part of the visual narrative and user experience that has been splintered. What makes these kinds of projects of recovery so important and so inherently difficult is the unexpected complexity of the medieval book. We live in a very different moment, for our modern books are a dime a dozen and are churned out by machines in enormous quantities. A medieval book, in contrast, is a handmade masterpiece, each one the result of many years' work by a bevy of rigorously trained and highly skilled artisans. A single page is by its nature a fragment of a larger project, which was designed to work in concert, both textually and visually, with the other pages. Few are aware of what actually went into making a manuscript, so I thought I would provide a brief overview of the fascinating process through which these books were created. Imagine for a moment that you are a monk in medieval Europe, and you've just been assigned the task of creating a book from scratch. How do you even start? You first have to decide what book you are copying. Since most manuscripts were not being written for the first time at that moment, but were copies of an established text, such as the Bible, you would have to get a hold of an exemplar or model so that you have the words and basic layout provided so you can plan the whole thing. Then you need materials. In medieval Europe, paper wasn't introduced until the late Middle Ages, so a book had to be made out of animal skin known as parchment. The type of animal depended on what you had locally available and what you could afford to use. Do you want steak or lamb stew for dinner for the next few weeks? Beef? Okay. Then someone will need to kill an entire herd of cattle for your book. How many cows exactly would depend on how big your book needs to be. If it is to be sung from by an entire choir, it needs to be huge, so you could read from it from far away. So that might require using an entire skin for just one page. But if you're planning on a book that you can keep in your pocket for daily prayers, you only need a handful of animals because the skin can be folded many times to create lots of smaller pages. So once the cows have been slaughtered and everyone is really sick of eating beef 3 times a day, their skins need to be soaked in a lime solution to loosen up the layers of fat and hair. Then the skin is stretched out on a frame and carefully scraped with a sharp knife. Rinse and repeat. The surface has to be even, thin, and perfect in order to receive the ink properly. After it is at the proper thickness, and you have sewn up any large holes that form during the overzealous scraping, you are ready to turn it into pages. The extra bits are trimmed, and you have a rectangular sheet. This is folded down to the scale of the book, and the resulting group of pages generated from that skin will eventually be sewn together into the book in a little pamphlet known as a quire. Once you have your quire, you will need to rule the lines on the page so that the scribe can keep his writing even and straight. The trick is to use a tool, either an awl or with a sharp point, or else a small wheel with evenly spaced spikes to prick tiny holes up the sides of the pages. It's a little hard to see in here, I'm sorry, the light's a little hard, but can you see these holes down the side here? These are pricking points. And then you take your ruler and you line it up to the corresponding holes on either side of the page. So you would have matching ones over here, which are probably not visible in this picture. A stylus, a pointed metal tool that's kind of like a pen with no ink, can then be used to press a line into the parchment along the ruler, leaving a line that is visible and raking light to the scribe, but almost invisible to the reader when the book is done. And I think you can see them here a little bit. It's a little hard to capture this because you really have to use raking light, but in later times they actually would use ink to line these, to rule the lines. So a lot of times you'll actually see lines on the pages, but in earlier books they wanted it to kind of be invisible. So next you're going to need ink. You're going to have to forge for iron gallnuts, little growths that form on oak trees due to chemicals you need to copy from the example you're working on. And then you can both be working simultaneously and cut the workload in half. Now it might only take 2 years. Once all of the pages have been written, each has to be allowed to dry. Just be careful not to leave them out where your cat can saunter across them while the ink is still wet. After the pages have been checked for mistakes, now the artsy monk gets to add his touch. You'd better have left some room for his art, or he's going to go medieval on you. He'll probably want to do some fancy initials, maybe paint some designs in the margins. Or he may even want entire pages left blank so he can create scenes to illustrate the text. So here's hoping that you planned this carefully from the beginning and left the right amount of space for him. He's going to come in with paints made from plants and minerals, which might include thinly pounded gold or even more expensive blue pigment created out of crushed lapis imported from Afghanistan. It's likely he may also feel it's important to make the smaller initials at the beginnings of each new verse ornate too, not just for visual effect, but so that the reader will be able to find their way through the text more easily. And then, of course, no one likes empty space, so where the lines of text end early, he's going to want to paint those in too. So once the book is completely finished, all the pages need to be assembled in the correct order and each quire is sewn down the middle. Then all of those groups of pages are sewn into a binding, usually composed of wood boards covered in leather or parchment. A sip of celebratory wine, and the process starts all over again. So I have walked you through this process in hopes of laying the groundwork for a better understanding of how integral a manuscript page is to the book that it's in. These are complex, sophisticated objects that were designed with the whole in mind. When a piece of these complete works is separated out, it both changes the character of the book and loses meaning when it's circulating on its own. Take, for example, this page. Here is a sheep. He's standing at the bottom of the page, holding bells in his hooves and walking on his hind legs. What is he doing? Why is he here? The text above says nothing about sheep. You can look for clues on the back side of the page, but now it makes even less sense. We find an image of the betrayal of Christ in the initial with an elephant rambling along underneath. The text is about Christ, so at least the initial makes sense, but it doesn't mention sheep, and it definitely doesn't talk about elephants. So how are we to understand the artist's bizarre choices for imagery here? Without the context of the rest of the book, this would be impossible to sort out. Fortunately, although large portions of this manuscript are indeed missing, the section with these strange animals has remained intact. Let's start with our sheep, followed by the elephant. As we move to the next page, we find yet another animal. So now there's a pattern, although they seem unrelated. But as the series of animals unfolds, we start to recognize that they are not random, but that they belong together, and we must understand them together. The key to unlocking this subject comes halfway through this section of the book. Once again, if we only had one of these leaves, we would still be in the dark, as the image bridges across 2 pages. But as we read them together, we find a fox under a blanket being carried by 2 other animals on some sort of stretcher. So we add this into the mix. After this comes more animals, now carrying liturgical instruments like censers. There's a wolf bishop, so we also have official church figures. And ahead of him march others with processional crosses and holy water. So the final animal is a rabbit rigorously ringing church bells. Taken all together, it is possible to recognize that this is a coherent story. As I said, the fox is the key, for he is Renard the Fox, a popular figure in medieval tales. He was a trickster with whom the other animals had a love-hate relationship. In one story, he cheats at chess, and when his opponent catches him, he's nailed to the chessboard. Bleeding, he passes out, and they think he's dead. His death is announced to the animals, and they come together in a funeral procession, and it is this procession that we've watched unfold. What is not shown, but is implicit in the images and would have been known to the viewer, is that when Renard reaches the church, he jumps up and declares himself alive. The fact that he is alive is slyly suggested by his open eye as he is being carried in the procession. It's really hard to see, but his little eyes open there. When the animals realize that he's no longer dead, the rabbit rings the church bells and they rejoice. What is truly remarkable about this sequence is that, in fact, it is carefully paired with the text above. The main text recounts the death and resurrection of Christ. The fable running below then parallels this in a sophisticated and playful way, relating the story of the death and resurrection of Reynard the Fox. So this fascinating and complex image cycle is like none other known, and survives today as a unique creation by artists 700 years ago. Should only a page have survived from this cycle, all of this would be unrecoverable, and its rich layers lost to us.
Is this in our collection?
It's in the Walters collection, yeah. So this is the challenge that faces me as a curator of manuscripts. Knowing the complex ways in which medieval artists thought and worked makes it especially difficult to come to any conclusions when faced with a single leaf. But it's my job to solve these mysteries and place a work in context and rediscover its roots. What book did it come from? How was it used? What did it mean to those who made it, and who was using it? I recently tackled a single leaf in our collection that had been languishing in storage, unresearched since its purchase in 1953. I thought it might be interesting for you to hear how I approach something like this and what the rediscovery process can look like. And just to point out, just so it's clear, this is the front of the leaf, and this is the back of the leaf. So I'm just showing you both sides here. This isn't two actual leaves. So for me, it's almost like solving a murder mystery. I study the page carefully, looking not only at the big picture, but also scouring for even the tiniest of clues. The first big picture elements I start with is actually what text remains. What is the text, and what can it tell me about what the book used to be? In this case, the text is critical for identification because it's the beginning of the canon of the Mass. As this marks the ceremony during which the Eucharist is celebrated, the presence of this text tells me that the book the leaf came from would have been liturgical, something used by the priest during services. That narrows down the possibilities to really either a sacramentary or a missal, although without further text, I can't be sure which of those books it was, because while they both had the canon of the Mass, other aspects of the books did vary. But that's a start. So next, because I'm an art historian, I look carefully at the art. The scene of the crucifixion reinforces the fact that this was from the spot in the service where the priest talks about Christ's sacrifice, so the image and text work together and are clearly contemporary with each other. The use of simple pen drawings, instead of heavily painted figures, helps me narrow down to Germany or Switzerland, where pen drawing became popular. This kind of pen drawing hits its height of popularity around 1100, so that it helps me narrow down the date a bit, as does the fact that Christ has open eyes and is basically standing upright against the cross. Not much later than 1100, he starts to be depicted as more visibly suffering, with his eyes closed as if dead. Sorry, I think I jumped too far. His eyes closed as if dead, his body slumped, pulled down by its own weight. So I can guess from all of this that it was a book that was used by during church services in either Germany or Switzerland around 1100. Next, I start scouring hundreds of other manuscripts from that time in those places, looking for similarities in artistic style, in ink color, in script. Nope. No. Yeah, really no. Oh. Yes, maybe. After much searching, I find something that feels similar. It's almost like recognizing the distinctive family nose in a photograph of a lost relative. Your gut instinct tells you that there's some kind of relationship there. So often it just feels right, almost like a puzzle piece kind of clicking into place. So I look for all the markers that I need to find. Comparable kind of ink drawing, check. Style is similar? Yep, check. Script similarities. At first glance, they're incredibly similar, but I dig deeper. Does the scribe write distinctive letter forms the same way? So how does he finish off the tail of his Q? Or the top of his A? After drawing careful comparisons, I can determine that the handwriting is very close, if not identical. So if it's not the same scribe, they clearly had the same training. So taken together with the other similarities, I can now say that I believe these manuscripts were likely made in the same place. In this case, I could actually identify the place of creation for our mysterious leaf, a tiny monastery called Schaffhausen in Switzerland, not far from the German border. Manuscripts were only produced there for a short time in the decades around 1100, so the timing fits. A few more clues from the page tell me about its life after it was created. Original medieval tags on the edges of the pages, which helped its user find the page quickly, tell me that it was meant for use and wasn't just sort of a decorative, beautiful, gift kind of object. And the amount of wear and grime on the page show that it was actually heavily handled. An inscription in the margin, added in a later hand, provided updates to the text a few centuries later, showing that it was still in use. And then I noticed that there was an old page number written in 15th or 16th century style Roman numerals, which suggests that it was still being used as much as 400 years after its creation. And finally, there's a ragged edge where it was not cut, but clumsily torn out of the book, which suggests that it was removed with some haste rather than carefully preserved. Taken together, it is likely that the leaf may have come from one of the many liturgical books that were destroyed in that region during the Reformation, and this page may have been salvaged due to its image. A lot of careful looking and tracking down clues eventually led me to be able to recontextualize this page, identifying its use, place of origin, and something of its afterlife. And it took me about a year to figure all this out. Yet I still don't know some things about it. Is it from a sacramentary or missal? Was there other art in the rest of the book? And if so, might the surviving image have been part of that story? Was it really removed from its book during the Reformation? And if so, where was it for the next 400 years? If not, is the rest of the book still out there? It's doubtful I will ever actually know the answers to these questions, so I have to be content with the fact that I was able to recover as much as I could about this lost soul and reinsert it into the history of its sister manuscripts. And so, having discussed manuscripts and the complications inherent in taking them apart in what I hope is an illuminating way, pun intended, I would like to consider what the future looks like for these orphan pages. While hopefully minimized in our modern time, the historical scattering of leaves cannot be undone. But it can be taken as an opportunity, for it has left us with an incredible treasure hunt, one that is an extremely effective teaching tool. Many of my fellow manuscript scholars, notably Lisa Fagan Davis and Judy Oliver, have dedicated much of their time and energy to tracing leaves such as those dispersed by Otto Egge. And that's in an attempt to sort of rediscover the overall character of those books that he was cutting up. Davis in particular has become a passionate Egge scholar, not only attempting to find those leaves as part of her personal scholarship, but also using them as an opportunity to teach a new generation in the art of manuscript detective work. She and her students have made great strides in tracing pages and piecing them together and trying to pull back together what had been scattered. I believe that the way forward, in so many respects, is actually digitization. That will ultimately be the key to pulling together pages scattered across time, not just by Egge, but by centuries of manuscript enthusiasts and biblioclasts alike. And digitization is likewise the answer to the question that plagued Egge: how to give the general public access to books too precious to be owned and too fragile to be viewed. At the Walters Art Museum, we've been asking that same question. Henry Walters, the museum's founder, was an intense bibliophile and specifically left his art not to the museum he founded, but to the people of Baltimore. It was his deepest belief that art didn't belong to one man, but to everyone, and his desire to share the joy of his collection with the public has been our guiding principle. Rare books and manuscripts are especially difficult to share, for their fragility and light sensitivity severely restricts the amount of time that they can be viewed in the galleries. Bibliophiles like Egge and Walters must have been perpetually frustrated by these inherent limitations. And while Egge found a solution in sending parts of manuscripts out into the world to increase their visibility, Walters invited people into his library to experience the books. And that's a picture of his old library, the way it used to be. They used to lower the manuscripts down for people in this basket that's hanging here. Neither man could have anticipated the game-changing possibilities of digitization. However, in 2007, my department recognized that potential, and we applied for our first preservation and access grant from the NEH. Having received 3 generous grants over the past decade, the Walters is now continuing that work on its own, committed to digitizing every page of its 937 manuscripts. What is more, we decided to make those pages free to everyone, not only to view, but also to publish and reproduce in any form. Our digital manuscripts are now being enjoyed and studied in millions of classrooms and homes throughout the world. I would like to think that bibliophiles like Otto Agee and Harry Walters would be genuinely thrilled about how truly accessible medieval manuscripts have become through technology that they could never have dreamed would be possible. As I navigate the legacy of leaves and manuscripts that these men left behind, their philosophies echo in my ears. Closed books locked away on hidden library shelves cannot inspire new generations to fall in love with them. Only through sharing these treasures can we ensure that they and those who love them live on. Thank you.